So I'm glad that I have this opportunity to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart these days, which is the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. Four words that you probably are not, that you're familiar with, but it's really surprising how many people are not familiar with the NSDI as a whole entity. We were talking the other night about this and wondering whether it might be, in fact, is it 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million people that if you asked them what a national spatial data infrastructure was, that they would know what it was and could say something about it. In any case, it's a pretty small number. So I'm going to be talking about the NSDI today from a couple of different hats that I wear. Primarily one from an entity called the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations, or COGO, and I'll be talking about COGO a little more later. But the entity that I work with, my employers, as it were, the University Consortium for Geographic Information, UCGIS, is one of the member organizations of COGO. So that's one reason why about a decade ago I started working with COGO on the NSDI activities. So in our talk today, I'm going to go through these different topics, talk really briefly about SDIs and NSDIs in general, talk a little bit about how the NSDI in the US has developed and evolved, talk about a thing that you all may be most familiar with, the data part, the geospatial data part of the NSDI versus the other things. And in that sense, I want to remind you about all of our national geospatial data assets, what they are, who's responsible for them, and how we access them. And then I'll talk about COGO and the way that COGO does every 4 years a survey of the NSDI, and talk about the current. Well, we do an assessment of the NSDI every 4 years, and currently the survey that we use to collect data is currently open for a few more weeks till the end of September. So I definitely want to share that with everyone. Okay. Again, briefly, let's talk about just an SDI in general. Instead of, we'll talk in a minute about the national idea. Anytime you're putting together spatial data as a collection, one way that it could and should be approached is an organizational framework to include not just the data itself, but a recognition that that including technologies, policies, standards, and human resources alongside the digital data itself is what's really important in order for you to have a holistic approach to acquiring, processing, storing, distributing, and improving the utilization of it. So just the data itself, some kind of drive on a server that has a lot of data is not so useful on its own unless you have all of this, what we call infrastructure, around it. So the infrastructure are really the important policies about everything that a policy around the geospatial data might involve. Restrictions, licenses, agreements about usage of the data. Standards are absolutely a key topic that we'll get into a little bit more about how the data need to be organized and compiled so that we can really have these things be as useful as possible. So that's the idea of having data and the infrastructure that's around it. The fact that it's spatial data is important for us because everyone on this call probably works primarily with spatial data. But the truth is that a lot of the data that ultimately can be useful with spatial data, because we have standards in place, because we have the metadata in place, we are able to do a lot of work with non-spatial data that may not have any kind of location component to it. But because of all of the connections that we have, we're able to work on much more important, interesting projects because the infrastructure is there with our spatial data. Usually an SDI, and again, this is not necessarily, SDIs can be a very small thing. Any organization should organize their own spatial data within the context of it, like enterprise perspective. So you're always going to have the four main components that are always referenced have to do with the technologies. As I said before, the technologies in this case are going to include all of the different ways that you might be storing and accessing those data. Those very important policies, the arrangements, the agreements, the licensing, anything that's going to ultimately affect how the data can be accessed and used and maintained. So many different things here. The standards, which really allow the data to be used by people into the future and by people to be able to expand the audiences. I was part of a podcast yesterday talking about an NSDI, and it's really, if you think about an NSDI, which I'll get to in a minute, the national part, as some kind of the metaphor of a really large highway. And in order to be able to merge and exit, to on-ramp and off-ramp off of a highway, the way that a user would be able to go on and start using the data and to cease using the data to get off the exit ramp, that's where the kind of the standards come in. You can't be interoperable with some other highway if you don't really understand how it is that you can merge into that context, access and use the data, and then depart safely and with what you need. So those are the standards. The standards are absolutely key for all of this. And then there's always the human resources, the people who are part of all of this as well. We'll talk about the people because you can't make an institutional arrangement. No policy or standard would exist without the people behind it. So it's funny that we keep these as separate components when in fact they are all integral to work together. So a national spatial data infrastructure is the idea that you can have a spatial infrastructure, a spatial data infrastructure that functions with its goal to be useful at the national level. For us, it's really important to keep in mind national is not the same as federal. So a lot of our data sets that we often might think about are produced by the federal government. And we'll certainly talk about those in a minute. But a national spatial data infrastructure actually covers many different things comprise that, including lots of our data sets that are originally collected and curated and maintained and distributed by local governments, by nonprofit entities, by state level. State level, of course, is super important to contribute to an NSDI. And ultimately, you don't really have a national spatial data infrastructure unless you have the incentives and the policies and the agreements in place to be able not just to use your federally produced and distributed data sets, but also all of these other ones from all of the different communities that exist out there that are producing data and distributing it and maintaining it, et cetera. I really like, while we think about the NSDI, when we think about the NSDI, we often think about, digital data, which of course is going to be within, mostly the last 40, 50 years. But I really like the fact that it was really back early in the very early 20th century when there was federal recognition that we needed to have some kind of coordinated efforts, especially for our mapping and surveying from the very beginning. So now our executive orders are up in the 6 and 7 digits, but Executive Order 1906 was from President Teddy Roosevelt that established what was called at that time the U.S. Geographic Board. And that was a very early recognition that we needed to be very sensitive about not duplicating work and improving the standardization of maps. So those two things, the avoiding duplication by federal efforts and having not just standards, but standardization in place, have been critical for NSDIs since the very beginning of all of these efforts. Mapping and surveying were for decades really at the core of all of the federal efforts. In 1919, President Wilson had an executive order that created what was called the Board of Survey and Maps. Again, this was a lot of time when there were still lots of federal level efforts to map new territories, to map areas being acquired, to really start from cartographic perspectives to recognize too around this time that it wasn't that the federal agencies who were working on these things also had to be very sensitive to the people who were going to be using these, the stakeholders. So for the first time, we had a lot of private consumer citizen interest in having access to these maps so that they could go out and explore and discover and settle and all the other things that we might have been doing with maps at that time. So I always like the fact that the public as an important stakeholder was first referenced in that 1919 executive order. If you know anything about the US National Spatial Data Infrastructure, you're going to have heard before this OMB, which is the Office of Management and Business, OMB, Office of Management and Business. Circular
Management
A6.
and budget, I think.
Management and budget, that's it. It's management. Thanks, David. I knew that OMB business didn't sound right. Management and budget. So OMB Circular A16 is still a very important document today, but it first came out and that Office of Management and Budget is important because it really controls a lot of the finances that go to support these activities that other federal agencies are saying we want to do and we're going to start doing. So for the very first time in 1953, OMB came out with this document, the Circular A16, and for the first time started describing and then thinking about how it was going to be funded, these responsibilities of federal agencies to coordinate surveying and mapping. And surveying and mapping were still really what was central at that time. We didn't have a lot of digital information coming out in 1953. So that Circular A16 has been revised again and again and again, and it's still an important document that people will refer to, and it's interesting to know that this was the original history of it. Fast forward a few decades, that circular was revised, and one important revision, and I don't have time to go through all of the ones that happened over the decades between early 1950s and 1990, but one important revision happened in 1990. It was the first time that the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the FGDC, which is an acronym that many of you are probably familiar with, the FGDC was first established out of that OMB circular revision in 1990. A next executive order in 1994, this is another really important one for us, was the first time that a national spatial data infrastructure was referenced. It was in Clinton's executive order 12906. I'm sure people have other ways to refer to it quickly. And the important thing is, so around that, starting in those early 1990s, we started to have federal entities that were thinking about the concept of an NSDI. So an NSDI isn't something, it's not it's a thing, it's a concept. There's a lot of people that might refer to it as a philosophy of being able to have all of these federal, state, local, sometimes private, tribal, nonprofit data being able to be shared in the with a minimal amount to minimize duplication, to understand what's authoritative. And this is the idea of authoritative is important too, because it's pretty easy for us to think of the federal data sets that we might download from any number of different web portals as being the authoritative ones. We don't often question that. But when we think about an NSDI that necessarily has to include data from all of these different audiences, what does it mean to be authoritative? And how do you document that? So those are the conversations that started in the early 1990s. And extending into the 2000s, again, the circular A16 is revised and revised and revised. We end up having different appendices that are really important for it. 2008, the National Geospatial Advisory Council, NGAC, was established. This NGAC has, I think, 24-ish members right now. It serves a very, very critical advisory role for the FGDC. There have been, there are individuals on the NGAC who come from the academic community, so several of whom the UCGIS has nominated people to the NGAC over time. I think currently the NGAC has several people that came up through the ranks of working with UCGIS and working, in fact, kind of one step removed from iGuide, for example. So NGAC first came about in 2008. One of the things that happened in 2011, and this starts to be important for our geospatial data itself, is that for the first time, the circular was revised to include this Appendix E, which specifically listed a whole bunch of data themes. And within these data themes, there are lots of data sets. So a theme is broader than individual data sets. They defined how those themes, what were the extent of what those themes were. And importantly, they also started to designate who were the lead federal agencies who would have some responsibility over these, at least at the federal level. And these eventually became these national geospatial data assets I'll talk about in a minute. Finally, the last date I want to mention is this important thing, the Geospatial Data Act of 2018. This has been one of the most powerful, full of impact pieces of legislation which we've ever passed in the U.S. There was lots of communications around this thing, trying to finally get it. It was finally kind of went into law, signed during President Trump's first term, underneath the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority's reaffirmation, whatever that might have been happening at the time. But importantly, one of the most important things about came out of the Geospatial Data Act, which is now a law, was that it formally codified into law both the FGDC and the NSDI, and was able to say for the NSDI that we had to establish data standards, that all federal data had to have these standards in place. That it's a law that we share location-based info efficiently. And one of the things that's kind of come to bite us is that there were mandatory audits. And these audits have to happen every couple of years. Sometimes they're more frequently, sometimes they're less. But as our geospatial data assets have continued to expand, these, not just the themes, but all the data sets within them, these have to be audited constantly. So all of those lead agencies are now responsible for these audits, and it's kind of become a bureaucratic mess where that was not really so much of the original intent, of course. Okay, so again, the NSDI was, for the United States, was first really documented there, codified in the GDA of 2018. It talked about the technology, policies, criteria, standards, and employees. They didn't say human resources, employees necessary to promote geospatial data sharing. So sharing this is really central to any successful NSDI. So it's all of those entities plus the private sector, federal, state, tribal, and local governments, and the private sector, including nonprofit organizations and institutions of higher education. So it is much, much broader a vision than just what we think of as the federal data sets. That's one important message I just want to make sure that sticks throughout this. While all of this is happening, groups of experts are thinking a lot about this philosophy of an NSDI, writing reports, holding conferences, having workshops about how are we ever going to achieve this. We know it's a good idea. There's unambiguous support for the idea that an NSDI is a good idea, but how are we actually going to get there? One of the things that documents I've always really enjoyed is this 2001 report that came out from NASM called National Spatial Data Infrastructure Partnership Programs, Rethinking the Focus. And one thing that I like about this is that it talks about the concept of partnerships or collaborations across all of these different types of entities, levels of government, agencies, corporations. no doubt that these partnerships, as the report says, are designed to share the costs of creation and maintenance in order to avoid unnecessary duplication. So that's always really right at it. We don't need to be recreating the wheel for these data sets. And we have these lead agencies that have some responsibility for curating their theme and making sure that their primary data sets are the ones that are going out there in all these different ways. But it's the concept of partnerships. It is so difficult in reality, in practice, for us to make little incremental progress towards this vision of the NSDI, in part because there's so many reasons why government coordination, not just government coordination, but coordination among any entities to make sure that you have that authoritative data, that somebody is able to put their stamp of approval on it, ultimately, in all of the different ways that we have of data capture, which have expanded over time, and data distribution. It's just really super complicated, and we always want it there. We have the currency is another major complication of this, because it takes a long time to get something that's going to be put out there on a government portal. So again, one thing I have a resource slide at the end, which is going to include some of this, but the technologies, when people talk about the NSDI in the US, it's the technologies, policies and standards, human resources. The National States Geospatial Information Council, or NSGIC, runs a really nice series of podcasts all about the NSDI, and I'll add that link later to our list of resources here. Megan Compton is what used to be the Chief Geospatial Information Officer in Indiana, but Megan works now with FGDC. And one of the things I really liked that Megan was talking about recently in one of these NSGIC podcasts was about the challenges of governance. So if we think about all of these different people and organizations and entities moving towards this concept of an NSDI, how does it get governed? How do we make the incentives for everyone to play in the sandbox together and then be able to go and play in parallel sandboxes as well? So a successful NSDI is an interconnected geospatial ecosystem, but there's a lot of ways that we have to be able to assess what does success mean and over what time frame. Currently, the FGDC, again, that's the Federal Geographic Data Committee, which is the entity that has most responsibility and awareness of what's going on at the federal level around this, is within its NSDI strategic plan 2025 to 2035. They've had several sequences of strategic plans. I encourage people who are curious about this more to take a look at the FGDC's current strategic plan for the NSDI. One of the things that really comes out in this strategic plan, much more than any of the previous ones, is the recognition that if we don't make better progress in the partnerships and the governance, that all of our efforts to do everything else is for naught. So very much an expanded awareness for the US NSDI that we need to understand a supportable, realistic governance plan. So let's talk a little bit about just the data itself. And this, one of the things that the Geospatial Data Act and the NSDI codified was that we need to have, there should be one way through which the federal government distributes its national geospatial data assets. So that's what they're calling the digital data sets that fall underneath this various themes. So this has gone through several iterations over the years as websites and web portals have gotten better. Geoplatform.gov is the official NSDI distribution portal, we could say, for the National Geospatial Data Assets. And you can see down here, if you go to geoplatform.gov, by default, you're going to be able to have NGDA only, which is here. And then you might be pulling up any geospatial data asset. So that's what NGDA stands for. So discover authoritative federal geospatial data. So they wanted to have authoritative right here on the homepage, and it does say federal. So this is not necessarily the platform that's going to get you all other types of components that could be part of an NSDI, like data sets from different states, for example, or different nonprofits. But this should be the place where you would go for anything that the federal government has put its stamp of approval on and sent you out there. If you do a search for data sets on geoplatform.gov, you will find 391,347 different data sets. If you take a look at the topics that are there, I don't know why it's sorted the way it is, but transportation, and of course, these are going to be the numbers of data sets. So 94,000 different data sets, 94,000 plus different data sets that have been tagged as relevant to the theme of transportation. So a lot of these are different themes, and we'll look at those NGDA themes in a minute. One of the things that I always find amusing for somebody who tries to get students to be careful with their metadata and all of their work, somebody decided that geoscientific information ought to be a new theme. So it's tagged here as there's a topic, but we have 39,000 plus data sets that have geoscientific information as two different words, 438 that have geoscientific information as lowercase run together, 254 that have geoscientific information with a typo. One of these has the typo in it somewhere, but that has the geo and the S as a lowercase. 90 that have a few things capitalized, and then if you run it all together, I think this is the one actually with the typo. Yeah, we got 2 with the typo that make it through that. Everything where things must have been vetted to get onto geoplatform.gov, because not everybody can get their data sets onto geoplatform.gov. So this is the type of thing that undermines our understanding of what it means to have data that's up on the geoplatform, the government's geoplatform, period. How many of these things might actually be not the most current, not have the most complete metadata, not be exactly of what we need to be able to trust when we're saying this is capital A authoritative data coming from the federal government. So I'm not picking on them right now, but it's pretty frustrating to see this at times. The other thing, again, 391,347 different data sets. Remember that auditing idea. So we have built into law that all of the different key data sets, which are called the framework data, which I'll get to in a minute, have to have this pretty bureaucratic process of being audited on a regular basis. Back to all those different types of appendices. I mentioned Appendix E before from the OMB A16 2002 revision. These are what we call the NSDI themes. And these are going to be topics or categories. You saw some of these as topics within that geoplatform.gov. So we've got biological resources, cultural resources, elevation of bathymetric and terrestrial divided up, housing, hydrography, terms that we're largely familiar with. Cadastral data, for those of you who aren't as familiar with that term, has to do with parcel data. So cadastral has to do with the way it's often the data that are used primarily for real estate, in real property. We've got governmental units, which has also now been renamed governmental units and statistical boundaries. So that's all of your census. Those are all of your state boundaries, your census tract and county boundaries, everything that's going to have some formal type of perimeter, let's call it right now, for documenting, for being able to use those in an authoritative sense. So back in 2002, we had 34 different themes that were here. The yellow ones here are what they call the framework themes. And this is important for getting to what COGO does in its evaluation of the NSDI. There is a tremendous amount of data here. And ultimately, we're able to take what are considered the most core, critical, commonly used base data, which would be cadastral, digital ortho imagery, elevation and kind of clumped together, bathymetric and terrestrial, geodetic control, government units, hydrography, and transportation. So those were considered, starting in 2002, what were called the framework themes. Within those, of course, there are lots and lots of data sets. It's now been expanded a little bit. This slide doesn't show it right here. We actually have 9 framework themes because addresses, especially because of our national address database. Many people don't even know that we actually have a national address database underway. It is most of our addresses are compiled at the local level. So there are incentives and some legal ones, some other types of incentives to be able to get all of those local governments or local municipalities to share their addresses, essentially roll it up maybe to the county and then to the state level. And then the state is going to share their addresses that they have with this national address database. It's very much a work in progress, but it's the type of effort that is really necessary for the NSDI to move forward. So again, what we currently have are 18 NGDA, that's National Geospatial Data Asset themes. 8 of these are considered framework themes. This slide is a couple years old now, so this is as of March 2024. We've got these themes, and underneath this, we have all of these 171 NGDA data sets. Some of those data sets, we just saw another geoplatform.gov that had 300,000 NGDA data sets. So how do all of those fall across these different themes? Nobody really knows. But the important thing that's a little frustrating, again, is that there's the law in place. It says that all of our national geospatial data assets, like capital NGDAs, need to be audited regularly by the different responsible agencies for all of those. I didn't put the image in my slide here that shows who are the different, whether it's NOAA, Census, the USGS, Department of the Interior, who are all the different Department of Transportation, who are all the different federal agencies that sometimes have sole responsibility for being the lead agency. Sometimes it's shared responsibility, but individuals at all those agencies are responsible for regularly producing, assessing and producing audits, mandated audits about all of these NGDAs. So a ton of data, a really big effort. Everyone knows that this is a good idea. How are we going to get there? A number of years ago, I don't remember exactly when COGO was founded. I should. It became apparent that there are a lot of entities that do work around geospatial in the United States that are not part of the federal government, but that are really associations, nonprofits. I'm going to show you a list in a moment. And they decided that a lot of important things were happening, that we wanted to have an external non-federal opportunity to be able to make recommendations or make a statement about something. This was really important, for example, when we're trying to get the Geospatial Data Act of 2018 through Congress. So the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations said, we're going to create this. It's just a collection of a volunteer organization. We're not even a formal tax nonprofit. We work underneath, technically the very small amount of COGO budget that there is would go through ERISA, or ERISA's new name is Geospatial Professional Network. I should have remembered what that was too. So COGO says, okay, all together with all of our 14 different member organizations, which you'll see here, Geodetic Surveying, the American Association of Geographers, Civil Engineers, ASPRS, um, the International Association of Assessing Officers. They're the ones who work so much with cadastral data to do all of your real property assessments. Surveyors, the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science, my organization, which is why I started working with COGO. All of these entities together, plus their advisor organizations, some of these entities have their members are individuals, like AAG, you are an individual member of AAG. Others of these have other, they are like umbrella organizations for others, but altogether, it's about 200,000 people that you could say are individuals that are considered geospatial professionals or practitioners that have a formal paid membership affiliation underneath one of these entities. So COGO said we're gonna get together, we're gonna meet a couple times a year. When things come up, we will see whether we can we have to operate by consensus. That's the tricky thing. So nothing comes out from COGO that all 14 of those member organizations have not approved, which is why COGO often doesn't put out very many things. We try to do a few things that have a greater impact, and that's when we have a full consensus across this pretty wide range of organizations, it's going to have a greater impact ultimately. One of the things that COGO needed to do, it recognized that assessing the NSDI, and this is important. We're not evaluating anything about the data itself. We are really looking to see how well all of the progress towards the vision of the NSDI is going. Again, that vision of sharing, that vision of partnerships, that vision of how many standards have been developed, what kind of agreements are in place, what kind of sharing is happening across the tribes or different types of local government. So in 2015, COGO put out its first, at the time it was called a report card. And we said, okay, we'll take at the time, 2015, this came out actually fall of 2014 was when the effort was for. We said, we just looked at some of those framework data sets, cadastral, geodetic control, elevation, hydrography, orthoimagery, and this department here, that would have been at the time the lead agency from the federal government that had the most stewardship role over those. So USDA, with all of its imagery for orthoimagery data, it's really just all imagery. So Department of Interior and USDA. The group of geospatial experts who did the first one did a lot of review work and put out these different types of grades for some of these framework data sets. They also looked at the NSDI as a whole to try to say, okay, what's the condition? How much capacity do we have to continue to expand the NSDI? How much is the public using the data that are there? The grades were pretty mediocre, you can see. There are some reasons why some of these data themes like geodetic control always is going to score higher than the others. And there's a lot of interesting things about like the relative value of some of these data sets. And, if our geodetic control data were consistently getting a D-, we'd all be in a lot of trouble. Whereas maybe our boundaries, we might be a little more forgiving about. So COGO took on the responsibility to coordinate this assessment. We did it in 2015. We wanted to start doing it every 4 years. It's kind of been a little inconsistent. We came out with one in 2018. Addresses between 2015 and 2018, the address data theme, which Census and Department of Transportation are the primary custodians for. Again, that data theme was not one of the framework ones in 2015. We gave, you can see where the grades popped in here. It was pretty complicated in the 2018 one. If those of you who know Scott Frenshu, he was the primary editor of this report. Each one of these reports, this is now the 2018 and the 2024 were almost a 200-page document. because teams of experts in these different areas contributed to writing. It wasn't just one group of experts that wrote the whole thing now. It was maybe 5 to 8 individuals, subject matter experts, plus some liaisons from federal agencies, from these primary data custodian agencies that wrote the reports. We had some pretty high grades. We had government units going from C up to A minus. We had orthoimagery going to a B minus. A lot of people could argue that we had some significant grade inflation that might have happened with the 2018 one. And this is problematic because once you start getting an A minus on things, there's not a lot of places you can go. And is that a real A minus? If you think about all of the different things that an NSDI should be able to include, for example, for government units. We also came out with our last report in 2024. I now serve as the managing editor for COGO for these reports, which is why I happen to know as much about these as I do. The 2024 one, we didn't just use the subject matter experts, those 5 to 8 people in each data team producing their respective section of the whole report. We also, COGO ran a survey in 2023, the data from which was given to the teams to be able to add. So it was a very broad national survey, intended to be very broad national survey, especially to try to get users information. For example, every single person on this webinar right now has an opinion about how well you've been able, for example, to access your elevation data or any different things. There's lots of great questions that the survey includes. You can see here that we still have fairly high grades. There wasn't a lot of shifting. I think this was because this was kind of a reconciliation year that we really kind of get ourselves organized. We're going to make these assessments. We're no longer calling them report cards. Some of you may be familiar with the American Society of Civil Engineers infrastructure report card that comes out every 4 years. A lot of that ASCE, that's a huge, important report that infrastructure.org, I think you can go to that website. A lot of the data that ASCE is evaluating is ultimately spatial data, but not all of it. And we worked with ASCE to make sure that our report card or our assessment is staggered with theirs, so that theirs comes out every 4 years, ours does now as well, more or less. But we want to make sure that we are staggered in between their cycle so that we can each use as part of our input for our assessment their data as well. So COGO is currently in its cycle to publish a report card in 2027. We've got to get it out in the fall of 2027. We are currently running that survey that I just described. It is a much better organized, more robust survey that really focuses on the things that we are assessing, that condition, the capacity, the public use, the access. How is it that, some of the trustworthiness, like how frequently do you end up being able to successfully integrate some of these NSDI federal data sets in some situations with your own data? How often do you roll up if you're from an entity that collects data? How often do you roll it up and provide it to other groups to be able to share as well? So the current survey, and I'll make sure everyone who's on this gets that link again, but the current survey is open through the end of this month. We're aiming to get a few thousand responses, and then these data will be going to those teams that are already involved in running the next assessment. So that's I think this is my last slide. No, I've got some resources here, and I'm going to make sure that a couple more get added to this as well. That's where I wanted to end this, just talking about the idea that the NSDI is a critical thing in so many different ways. Their NSDIs are tried to be maintained by many countries around the world, and so there's also a very big effort for a global SDI. The UNGGIM group out of the United Nations thinks about that type of effort a lot. The US and many other entities contribute to those UNGGIM activities. The Open Geospatial Consortium, who's one of iGuide's partners, works very hard with US government and others because, as I said before, the standards for all of this work, you can't have an NSDI, any kind of NSDI in place if we don't have very thoughtful work around standards, because otherwise none of this is going to ever be able to have that interoperable, shareable, accessible component that is part of the ultimate vision achievement for that. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. Give you another chance right now if anyone wants to get that survey link. Stop sharing, and then please let me know. I know we're a relatively small group. iGuide likes its VCOs to be informal and interactive. If anyone has any questions about anything that I presented or about any other forward, near future or far future things about the US NSDI or others, this is a great time if you've got a question, or if you wonder sometimes how you might get involved. And I know I've had that question before. I'm a elected official here. I live in Ithaca, New York, and I'm a town board member for the town of Ithaca, not the city of Ithaca, the town of Ithaca. And it's when people say, how do I get involved in being more aware about what the NSDI could be? Part of this is myself talking with our geospatial people here at the town, saying how frequently do we share here in New York, share our data at the state level, at the county level and the state level? How often do we coordinate to check that that all the different towns within our county, for example, all have all of their central lines for their roads all connected? So being aware of that, there's so much important work that happens at the local level, which if we don't get our ducks in a row at the local level to be able to share the data more widely, we have to, we know it's hard, that all of this is really difficult, but it's really the local efforts that are going to make ultimately a difference in expanding and building an actual NSDI. Not in my lifetime, I'm afraid, but I think eventually there will be versions of NSDIs and people who get to think about how are we going to really measure success in different and important novel ways. Any other questions? Sina, I see you're on the call, and maybe there's something about from the OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium perspective you'd want to say. One thing that OGC has been doing is working on some pilot projects to see, can we think about some use cases around showing the impact, the benefit of having an NSDI in place. And OGC is doing a little bit of that work, again, with coordination with the Federal Geospatial Data, Geographic Data Committee and others. That's one of the next steps to try to build awareness. There's a constant need to build awareness about the NSDI and to document its return on investment. And that's one thing that NSGIC, the National Geospatial Information Council, which essentially is the top geospatial information officer for every state, is going to be, every state is part of NSGIC. So that's where a lot of the important work happens. It's the national federal level is kind of overwhelming at times, but every state is better and getting better and better at having a good handle on reducing duplication at its own, across its own entities, and being able to share across entities. David Tarbotton, yes.
So I'll ask a question since you seem to be fishing for them a little bit. So I'm really impressed by all the data that's out there. What can somebody do if they find a problem in the data? And I guess I know of certain problems in, for example, the National Hydrography data sets, which I was able to see is actually available on GeoPlatform, which is something I learned about new. I was aware of it available through the national map, but there's another linkage there that was new to me. But I guess maybe in general, what are the sort of efforts underway to help citizens provide the information to fix things that are wrong? Because it seems like a
Yeah.
daunting enterprise to get into.
Of course it would be. I think it's important that there are lead agencies that have some kind of stewardship responsibility ultimately, so you don't have to just, write to the White House and say, hey, there's a problem with the hydrography data set. So every agency has also done much better at being able to have ways where people can comment on these. A lot of the federal agencies you'll see are now using Esri's different platforms to be able to distribute things. Esri and the federal government work very closely in having these different types of data portals that they put out there. And one nice thing about all of those platforms is there are mechanisms to comment. I don't think that any one single comment is ever going to, probably it's unlikely that one comment is ever going to get things fixed. But this is an area where, for example, the work that you do with Quasi, if you end up having an entity like Quasi that has a little more influence and a little more reach than any individual, this is an opportunity to say, hey, these hydrography data sets are really important to Quasi. These are the types of problems we're seeing with the data, and here are some specific examples, and be able to become the squeaky wheel. I think this is an opportunity for people who are the actual users of these data to keep track of what they're finding, to document it in professional ways with specific useful things, because it's not so helpful when we all point out what the problems are without possible solutions, and be able to communicate consistently, frequently, often. So I think that's a role for an entity like a Quasi. That's an opportunity for something like UCGIS to be able to do things for the type of data it's used. There's so many, and that's an example of where not COGO as a whole necessarily, but all of those different member organizations and advisory groups of COGO, there are different data sets that matter more to you than others. Take some responsibility to see like where these things kind of fall apart. You can have data portals like you don't often use geoplatform.gov. We're supposed to have the exact same data. If you get a data set at a given scale and a given you should be able, if you're looking for like an identical data set across federally supported platforms, you should be able to have some trust that the data set X that you get from geoplatform.gov is going to be the same one that you get from the national map, is going to be the same one that you get from some other NOAA website. So part of what the agencies do at the FGDC level, and this is what NGAC often kind of pushes them, is to have those internal federal conversations across these agencies where they are communicating about the different platforms and portals and data sets that they're distributing. So that's the only realistic answer, Dave. It needs to be, I think at the individual level, it makes a difference, but I think the most impact is going to be at the state, at the nonprofit coordinated level. So societies that work with particular data sets, and then at the state level for where the particularly problematic things might be too. That can make a big difference if a state is complaining. I saw one thing come up in the chat, and then we're going to come up here. Yeah, as a person that utilizes geospatial data rather than creating it for my organization, what professional groups or associations do you recommend joining to help us stay up to date on developments? One of the things that I think individuals, I'll put this link in the thing. It used to be an entity called ERISA, and now ERISA is the Geospatial Professional Network, GPN. So I'm going to put this in the chat here. The Geospatial Professional Network is one of those entities that individuals can join, but also nonprofits can join. Businesses can join. There's all sorts of different ways to get involved. But this is the type of scale and scope of an entity which is where individuals can actually have the connections to be able to talk with people at higher levels, become aware of things. GPN is going to offer lots of different types of resources, newsletters, things. They'll host webinars. So I think that for individual users, this is the type of thing you might want to become familiar with. Especially if you work for an organization that crosses, it's not just specific to a state, like if you're a thematically organized thing. I think everyone ought to be familiar with whatever their own state's geospatial coordinating body is. Like, know your geospatial information officer. Lots of states have their own listservs, and that's where broader data and SDI topics are often discussed. That's where you're going to find people that know what an SDI is and care about it. So you can't build a successful network of networks unless you care about the things that NSDI is trying to promote at all different levels. Okay, well, that was exciting for me to talk about. Again, 1 in a million people out there might actually care about the NSDI, even though we actually every single day are connecting, interacting, relying on these different components that are part of it. So, all right, stay tuned for other forthcoming iGuide virtual consulting offices next week. There's going to be a pretty interesting one by, I can't remember the title right now, but it's by one of our community champions. And yes, one of the UCGS community champions working with iGuide. And there's lots of great topics coming up. So stay tuned, and thanks everyone. I'm going to sign off.